Pessoal, hoje a For Linux fará um Hangout com o Matthew, líder do projeto da Zend Framework, com o título de APIs na velocidade do pensamento. Esse Hangout terá 20 minutos de duração, com 10 minutos abertos para perguntas. Quem vai fazer a tradução das perguntas será o William, que é o nosso líder da área de inovação de PHP aqui na For Linux. A melhor pergunta o Matthew vai escolher, né, e sorteará uma licença de Zend. Mas ele vai falar um pouquinho melhor pra gente sobre o que é essa licença e tal, mas é algo bem legal. A For Linux criou uma área de inovação em PHP. Essa área, junto com a equipe de infra, criou o ForShot. Esse ForShot, quem tiver interesse em saber melhor o que é, entra no site, que é www.forshot.com.br. Lá tem mais algumas informações. A For Linux também é Zend Solution Partner. Necessidades complexas em PHP, conte conosco. Agora, com o nosso grande mestre aqui, ele vai apresentar para a gente. Matthew.
Hello, everybody.
It's okay.
We're all set, I assume. Okay, my name is Matthew Finney. So you've just been introduced to me. You were staring at my ceiling because I'm standing at my desk today. It's more fun to do these demos when you're standing. Eduardo is claiming I look nervous. He's chatting at me, and yeah, I'm a little bit nervous because, it's the first time we've done the Hangout this way, so this will be fun. I'm going to share with you today a project called APIgility, and APIgility is a project to allow you to build your APIs at the speed of thought. I'm going to do a few slides for you here to start off, just to give you a little bit of background, but then I'm going to do a little bit of live coding to show you what is possible with APIgility and just give you a little taste of it and hope that you're going to play with it some more. You probably need an API and you don't even realize it at this time. You might be in some sort of organization that has many different teams doing many different languages. So for instance, you might be doing one team that's using .NET or another team that's using Java, and they need to be able to get at the data that you are acting as the bastion for within your organization using PHP. So in order for them to be able to do that, because the languages don't have any natural bridge, you can expose an API to do that. Similarly, they can expose an API to you so that you can get at their data. They may already be doing that even, and hopefully you're trying to do that as well. The other reason is that you might have many partners or clients distributed in different places. Good example of this is when we have, for instance, a travel agency. And that travel agency might have different people distributed in different areas, working under different companies that need access to your information. So they may want to be able to book some tickets through you. For them to be able to do that, they need to be able to ask you about those tickets. And you don't want to be taking a phone call for all of that. You want to automate it as much as possible. So to do that, you expose an API, and now they can use the API to say, is the ticket available? If it is, then they can use the API to book that ticket, and now your data is updated. They have all the information they need. Everybody's happy. The other reason is potentially what you're even watching this webcast on, which is a mobile device. It might be your phone, it might be a tablet, but increasingly this is how people are consuming data that we are storing on our servers. And the way that they get at that data is not directly on their tablets or their mobile device. Their devices are making API calls to you. So you need to expose an API so that you can write an application in the native format for that particular device, but have all the different devices communicating in the exact same way and updating the same data in all the different locations in the same place. So you're doing this using PHP and you're exposing an API. Problem is that APIs present a whole bunch of different choices for you. You've got little details like, are we going to use RPC or REST? RPC is remote procedure call. It's how we always used to do things. SOAP is an example of this. XML RPC is one. REST is considered the new hot thing in APIs. It stands for representational state transfer. It's basically using HTTP to its full potential. The question is, which one are you going to use? There are good use cases for both, and sometimes you actually want a mix of those. When it comes down to the actual API, once you've made that decision, you have to figure out, how do I want to represent it? Is it going to be JSON? Is it going to be XML? Are you going to be doing something strange like YAML? Do you want to actually be able to expose things as HTML sometimes as well? You have a choice as to how you're going to expose the API, and that's one more choice that you have to make as you're developing it. Error reporting is another thing that's very difficult because we often forget to do it. As a consumer of an API, you want good error reporting so that you know when something goes wrong and you know what it is that you did wrong so that you can fix it next time that you make the call. Error reporting should be consistent and it should use HTTP specification to its full potential, and that includes doing HTTP status codes, making sure that you use the correct status code for the correct error. Too often I see APIs that return a 200 OK and then have somewhere in the main body an error and it says, success, failure. That's not good. I actually want to be able to know from the outset, do I have an error? And then I can introspect the body in order to get the error details if I need them. HTTP method negotiation is another aspect. If somebody makes a patch call to your API and you don't support it, how do you report that? How do you report what actual HTTP methods are available? Quite often, again, these go neglected and people just pass it on as a general error without specifying what the actual error was. Content negotiation goes along with our second point there. If we have a specific format that we are going to be representing, what happens if somebody requests something else? Let's say they request XML, but we only support JSON. How do we report that? Additionally, if they want to submit data to your API, they need to do it in a specific fashion, and you need to determine what that fashion is going to be. Validation is something that we will probably be doing within our API. But one thing that I've noticed with APIs is that it's much better to spend the actual processing time on valid requests than it is to do it for invalid requests. So I don't want to open a connection to the database if the data that's coming in is invalid. In other words, you should fail early. So that's an aspect that I often look at as well in terms of a good API. Do I fail as early as possible? Authentication has many different ways of being implemented. We often use HTTP basic or digest, but that's thoroughly unsafe when we're going to do something that's a public API. So if we're doing a public API, we probably want to go with something like OAuth, which is tremendously difficult to implement on your own. Authorization is the act of taking that authenticated identity and determining if they can actually do what they're requesting to do with the API. Again, this needs to be built in and not just tacked on at the end. How do we do that? Versioning is another aspect. Quite often we develop our API and then discover later that we didn't do a really good job architecting it, or certain aspects are no longer necessary. We don't want to just remove things, because if we remove them, now clients that were depending on them are broken. But at the same time, we want to be able to move forward. The way to do this is using versioning, but it's easier to implement versioning if you plan for it from the outset, and most often we do not. Documentation is another aspect we often forget. Somebody's going to be consuming our API. If we just put the API out there, it's worthless. If we have documentation for the API, somebody will build something awesome with it. Are we doing documentation as we go or not? And finally, as we create our API, what happens next? In other words, as I make a request and do something with the API, what are the next steps that I can do? When we look at a web page, we have a really easy answer for that. There's these little sentences with blue underlines, and those are links. We know that we have to click on a link and that takes us somewhere else. How do we represent links within our APIs? When we use XML, there's some native ways of doing that, but with JSON, it's just objects. There's no native way of saying this is a link. So we have to make another decision about how our format is going to work. So those are some of the very difficult problems, and that's what APIgility was developed for. So I'm going to switch screens here. I'm going to share with you Zend Studio. APIgility itself is two things. It's an API builder, and it's the engine for an API. The API builder is simply a web application written in Angular communicating with an APIgility API that represents the administration. What we've done with Zend Studio is that we've incorporated the APIgility UI directly within to Studio, and it's just basically a web view. That said, because it is a web application, we're able to do some other things in it, such as being able to actually directly open the files that are viewed as source, and I'm going to show you that in a few moments here. When we first start, we have here an empty API. We don't have any APIs created, nothing set up. Now what I've done here is I actually have some code that I've written, and it's some code for generating and storing status messages. So I actually have a database adapter already set up, and you can see that in the lower right, DB status lib. So we're just going to ignore that for right now, but this exists. I'm going to go ahead and create an API. We're going to call it status, because Twitter is the hello world of APIs. I've now created one, and I want you to notice a few things. You'll see V1 up here. We start off versioning from the very get-go. I'm not going to show you creating a new version, but I can do that right here with a button that says create new version, and that will increment my version. Once I have incremented, I can select which version I'm going to look at. Editing is locked down to whatever the current version is, because once we've created a new version, the old version should not change in terms of its behavior. I'm going to first create a ping service so that we can ping the API. What this does is it creates a very simple RPC service which only allows the get HTTP method. This is perfect for our demonstration here, so I'm just going to go on here and I'm going to create a field. I'm going to call it ACK because he responds to a ping with an acknowledgement. Go ahead and save this. We'll go to our documentation, and I'm going to edit the documentation. Ping the API. For the GET request, we'll say ping the API for a timestamp acknowledgement. When I say generate from configuration, it will take a look at the fields I've defined and use those to give me back a representative response body. So we've now documented this particular API. If I were to go to the API docs now, we will see V1 is here. Here's ping. We can see that there's an operation with a GET request. We can see the expected request headers, the expected response status codes, expected response status headers, and what the body looks like. So what we have just done right now is defined a basic API that does everything that we need it to do. We've gotten documentation for free. However, this API doesn't do anything yet because it's empty. So we're going to take a look at the source code. For an RPC service, we create a controller. I'm going to click on this. Because I'm in Studio, it opens it up directly in Studio. I've evidently already defined this one. Normally it's empty. This is what I originally had. And now I'm going to tell it to do ACK time. And at this stage, we actually have something. We'll go ahead and save this. I'm going to switch screens here, and we're going to start looking at how it behaves. Going into Postman. I've got this running on a separate port, on port 8080. I'm going to go ahead and send this ping request, and we'll see what happens. And it looks like I've got a problem here. I know exactly what the problem is. Let me try this again. We'll send it. There we go. So we have an acknowledgement and with a timestamp, which is great. Let's see what happens if I change the header to say accept application XML. I'll go ahead and send this. And what we'll see here is a status code of 406, not acceptable. This is immediately seen as an error condition. Anything over 399 is considered an error condition, and in this case, it's a client error condition. We've indicated that we only accept XML, but the server says I can't actually do anything with that. Not only that, but we have a specific type here. And the content type is application/problem plus JSON. This media type is defined from a specification in front of the IETF called Problem Details for HTTP APIs. and we call it internally API problem, as that was a working name for the draft at one point. What that particular error reporting says is that there has to be a few fields present within the payload. The first one is a type or a described by, and what this will be is a URL to something that describes this particular problem. The title will be the same for this particular type every single time. In this case, not acceptable, and it goes to a particular section of the RFC 2616, which is part of the HTTP specification. The status is usually the same as the HTTP status code, in this case 406. And then we have detail, which is something that is specific to this particular invocation. In this case, we're saying we cannot honor the accept type specified. I can also specify anything else I want within this payload if I want to. And within APIgility, we do things like validation error messages going here. In debugging mode, you'll see stack traces and all sorts of things like that. So very cool things that are happening for you out of the box without me even having to think. I'm going to make another change here, and I'm going to make this a post request. We'll change this to a content type, and we'll say application JSON, because we know that we need JSON. We have a raw data in here. And I'll go ahead and send this. And what we see here is the method is not allowed. Again, a 405 in this case, a 400 error code because the client has made a mistake. If we look at the headers, I have an allow header with the particular header that I'm values that I'm allowed, which is in this case get. Finally, I'm going to do an options request here so we can see what happens. Kill the headers here, and we'll send that, and we'll see this is a 200 OK, but we again get this allow header. So what we're seeing from here is that I can go and describe my API very quickly and easily within a web-based UI. And this creates the rules for my engine. And that engine gives me things like error handling. It gives me some defaults for the representation. It gives me content negotiation. It gives me things like validation, of which I'm not demonstrating right now. It gives me authentication and authorization. These are all aspects of the UI that I can generate. And all of that is something I describe, and now that becomes part of the engine itself. And I don't have to think about it. I just go and create my code, put my code within the stubs that APIgility creates for you, and you're done. So that's APIgility in a nutshell for you. It's an API builder and a robust engine that gives you the ability to create well-formed and robust APIs. So now I'm waiting for questions, if I remember correctly. So I'm taking a look to see what those might be. Are those going to go in the group chat, Daniela, or the Q&A? So hopefully you're writing questions. I'm not sure if those go into the group chat or not. William and Marcelo have said that they will translate them for me. We'll find out.
Hi, Matsu, you're listening?
Hello, I can hear you.
Hi. Okay. Okay. Oh, I will read the questions. The first question is, I need to know Zend Framework 2 to work with APIgility.
So the first question is, do you need to know Zend Framework 2 to work with APIgility? No, you do not. That's one of the things that we're trying to make as easy as possible for you. We generate a few stubs for you. In the case of an RPC service, we're generating an RPC controller and also a factory for how you build it and put dependencies into it. That code you can just fill in, and it's very easy. There's just a method in there, and I put it in there. With the REST controller, with the REST services, we actually generate a few more things. There's what's called an entity, which is an object representing the particular item that you're trying to get at. A collection, which is a collection of these entities, and a resource, which is all the different operations that you can do that will operate on collections or entities and return collections or entities. Again, these are stubs. You can put in any code you want in there. You don't have to know how Zend Framework 2 works. If you learn how Zend Framework 2 works, or if you need to do stuff that you're not quite sure about, learning Zend Framework 2 will help, but you don't need to know it to begin with it at all.
Okay. The second question is, what kind of API is possible to develop with APIgility?
Okay, so the question is, so what kind of APIs are possible to develop with APIgility?
Yes.
We do two different types out of the box, RPC and REST, in terms of the actual architecture. RPC are things that are typically actions, so things like register, transactions, that sort of thing, where you're not operating on individual items necessarily. REST is for things where you're working on specific items, and that's what's called a resource. And so that might be users, it might be statuses, it might be to-do items, that sort of thing. So there are all sorts of things you can do with those. What we do specifically within these is that RPC are represented as just vanilla JSON, so there's no linking by default. With REST, what we do is what's called HAL JSON. HAL means Hypermedia Application Language, and if you look for HAL JSON in Google, you'll find a specification for it. It's very simple. It has two special items to it. One is underscore links, which is how we represent links within JSON. That was one of the questions I mentioned that you have to think about as you create an API. And then embedded, underscore embedded, and this is for any other resources that are part of this particular entity or collection that are also addressable. In other words, things that you can address on the API. So it puts those two things in there. So we're doing JSON APIs. We're doing them both RPC and REST. You also have the ability to create, XML representations if you want to, or any arbitrary representation. But by default, that's what we give you so that you don't have to make choices. If you decide that you have other representations you need to do, we are flexible enough to accommodate those.
Okay, the third question is, what security resources are available on APIgility?
What secure resource? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Can you clarify?
What security resources are available on the APIgility?
Okay. So it's asking what security resources are available on APIgility.
Yeah.
There are a few things. First off, authentication. We offer out of the box HTTP Basic and Digest as well as OAuth 2 for authentication. It's a pluggable system, however, so if you want to use LDAP or some other, for instance, a token-based authentication, you can actually plug that in however you want. The other thing is the authorization. By default, we do authorization on a per service and per HTTP method basis. So I can go in and say, for this resource, say for instance status, I can go in and say that post and to the collection and patch and delete to the entity require authentication, and now the authorization rules are set up. You can also set up complex ACLs or role-based access controls if you want to. Again, it's pluggable. You go and you create those, you put them into the system, and it will use those. So that's the second piece that, for the security resources. The third is validation. That field screen that we saw, I just put in a description, but you can also put in filtering and validation. So I can go and describe exactly how I want to validate this particular field and filter it so that if it doesn't pass those validations, it gets kicked back out as a validation error before it ever hits my resource. So that's the third aspect that we provide out of the box. Fourth is when we do our representations, we have a number of things within the view layer to prevent things like cross-site scripting and other related sorts of attacks. And those are built into it because of the framework that we're using. So those are the various security aspects that we have in there by default. I may have missed one or two, but it's authentication, we have authorization, we have validation, and then filtering that goes on.
Okay, the next question is, APIgility can prove some kind of access report for debug or security purpose?
I'm typing these out so that I can remember them for later. Okay, so the question is whether APIgility can provide some kind of access report for debug and purposes. We don't provide that out of the box, and the reason is that there's a number of tools out there already that can provide this sort of thing. One of them is, of course, your server. So your server logs can go in and let you know exactly which API, which URLs were accessed and whatnot. There are also some great monitoring services such as Mastery and API and some of the others that exist out there that you can, or Apigee, I mean, that you can go and plug your API into, and they can manage the access reporting and the security aspects. Finally, because the system is pluggable, it's very easy to write modules for the application, Zend Framework 2 modules, that can go in and do some of that stuff and be reporting and that sort of thing if you want to keep it all in-house as well. We don't have that out of the box because it's one of those things that we feel is not core to APIgility, but it is something that some people are going to want, and they're going to typically have different needs based on the client and whatnot.
Okay, the next question, how can I build API with APIgility on the top of an application right in Zend Framework 2?
Okay, so they're asking how can I build an API built in APIgility on top of an application built in setup 2. We actually have a, in the documentation, we have a recipe for that. The reason being that APIgility consists of about a dozen or more Zend Framework 2 modules. And so what you can actually do is go and just add these modules to your Zend Framework 2 application, and now you have APIgility's engine and potentially optionally the UI as well for APIgility, and you can just expose it directly within there. We actually have in the documentation, I'm going to put it into the chat, so the main URL to the documentation, which is https:/apigility.org/documentation. If you look in the sidebar there, you will see a recipe for adding APIgility to an existing Zend Framework 2 application. Again, it's a matter of adding the modules to the application. You can use a composer to add them, and then you have to enable them within your application configuration. But if it's a Zend Framework 2 application, it shouldn't be a problem at all.
Okay. The next question is, do you have any studies showing how fast APIgility helps to create APIs, comparing with developers that don't use it?
Okay, no, we don't have any studies. It's a relatively new product. We just launched the stable version in May. What I can say is that when I have used it, even for creating demos, but also for creating some real-world APIs, what it has allowed me to do is focus on how do I want to interact with the API, and then I describe it within APIgility. If I already have the models in the code, then all I have to do is plug that code directly into APIgility. So it becomes very, very quick. As an example, one of the APIs I built was around uploading images. So I knew how I wanted to do that, and I was able to go in and describe how to do the image uploading in about 15-20 minutes. And so that took a little bit of time to just write down how I wanted to interact with things, figure out the validations for the files, that sort of thing. From there, since I already had the code for handling the uploads and storing them in the database and on the file system, all I had to do was go and plug that into there. I can actually do all of that within about 20 minutes. So it's very, very quick. If I were to try and do that from scratch, remember all those points at the beginning of the slides, all of those points have to be addressed. And that's a lot of different things. And what I've seen is typically what we do is we go in there and we're very happy when we get our first result, but we forget to add in error handling, we forget to add in options handling, content negotiation, all those things. Whereas I can go and describe the API and actually plug in my code in a very short amount of time and get all of that and not have to worry about it. I can tell you from experience to write all of that code by hand is going to take me days, if not weeks or months, in order to do that correctly. So, knowing how fast, that we don't have a study, but I can also tell you how long it took us to write APIgility, and it was months of work to get APIgility done and do it in a fashion that we knew was going to be robust. So if you think about the months that it takes for us to write the engine for APIgility versus the time it takes you to just describe it, I think you can see the benefits right there.
Okay, next question. Is there any certification for APIgility? If don't have, there any plan for that?
So the question is there any certification for APIgility or plans for certification for APIgility? Right now we're discussing training courses for APIgility, but we haven't had any discussion yet on certification for APIgility. If you are interested in certification, one of the things you can do is get certified for Zend Framework 2. As that will help you understand APIgility better and extend it better. But at this point, we don't have any certification for it.
Okay. Next question. What is the license of APIgility? Can I use on my closed source applications?
Yes, you can. The license on it is a BSD3 clause, which is similar to the MIT license. It essentially gives you freedom to use it in any setting so long as the copyright is maintained within the files. And that's it. You don't have to redistribute. If you do redistribute, that's the only onus that you have is to make sure that the copyright stays within the files of APIgility itself. Other than that, it's free to use for any purpose.
Okay. There is one last question. Question is, okay. I can see that it's possible to use database connection and custom codes for my APIs, but I wonder if there is an easy way to proxy APIs. If I already
Lost part of the audio just now. Okay.
If I already have.
Okay, I got as far as it's possible to use DB connection and custom code. Is there an easy way to proxy? And that's as far as I heard.
Okay, is the last question.
Can you repeat the question?
No, is the last question. Is it? Now you have to choose the best question. Yeah.
Okay. I will say the best question goes to the fourth question, which was no, third question. Sorry. What security resources are available for APIgility?
Okay.
So that's the winner of the Studio license.
Okay. Thanks.
Perfect.
Hi, Matthew.
Hello,
This is Marcelo. We finished. Thank you very much. You already the best question. Thank you for your time. And it was very good. We are going to upload right now the video. And in the near future, we're going to put some translation for all your presentation.
Excellent. Thanks for joining today.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.